The date is October 6, 2025. The world is staring at two burning fronts, Ukraine and Gaza. But somewhere along the Gulf of Guinea, far from the cameras, another storm is forming. Not of missiles, but of maps. Not of war, but of power. While no one was watching, Russia made a quiet but monumental move, signing a military and trade pact with one of Africa's smallest nations, Togo. On the surface, it looked like just another agreement training troops, sharing technology, port access. But what really happened was a geopolitical earthquake, one that could reshape the balance of power across all of West Africa. Because behind that handshake in Lomé lies something far deeper, a gateway. A way for landlocked nations like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the heart of Africa's gold and uranium, to finally reach the Atlantic without asking France for permission. For over half a century, trade in this region flowed through colonial channels. Now, a new map is being drawn by African hands, not European pens. And at the center of it stands a young soldier-turned-leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the 37-year-old president of Burkina Faso, whose vision of Pan-African sovereignty is turning old empires into spectators. But here's the question. The world isn't asking, is Africa truly stepping into its age of independence, or just trading one foreign master for another as Russian warships eye the port of Lomé, as Nigeria feels its dominance slipping, and as Washington scrambles to respond, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The struggle for Africa's soul has begun quietly, strategically, and irresistibly. So stay with us, because by the end of this story, you'll understand why this small stretch of coastline could become the fault line of the next great global shift, and why voices like Ibrahim Traoré's are forcing the world to listen. Please share this if you believe Africa deserves to write its own destiny, and subscribe if you think the truth is more important than the headlines. On October 6, 2025, in a quiet session inside Moscow's State Duma, a vote took place that would ripple across an entire continent. While Western media continued to broadcast scenes from Kyiv and Gaza, Russian lawmakers approved something that seemed at first glance almost ordinary: a defense cooperation agreement with Togo, a sliver of land between Ghana and Benin, home to barely 8 million people. But the implications were anything but small. The deal didn't just allow Russia to train Togolese troops or exchange equipment, it granted the Russian Navy access to Togo's deep water port of Lomé, one of the busiest on Africa's Atlantic coast. It was in every sense a quiet conquest, without firing a single shot. For context, Lomé isn't just any harbor. It's a logistical marvel, dredged, expanded, and modernized with funds from the African Development Bank and private partners. In 2024 alone, the port handled over 300 million tons of cargo, ranking among the top maritime gateways in sub-Saharan Africa. Its massive turning basin can now accommodate the same class of vessels that dock in Singapore or Rotterdam. In contrast, Nigeria's Lagos port, once the uncontested trade capital of the region, is choking under its own weight. Cargo there can sit for 2 weeks or more before clearing customs. According to the World Bank, it's ranked 358 out of 370 globally in efficiency. Meanwhile, Togo has cut average processing time down to 4 days at nearly 1/3 of the cost. The math is simple but devastating. A 40-foot container that costs $4,800 to move through Lagos costs about $1,500 in Lomé. For shipping giants like MSC Mediterranean Shipping Company, that's not a statistic, it's a reason to switch routes. And they already have. Their newest container fleets now bypass Lagos entirely, docking straight at Lomé's state-of-the-art terminal, a move that shifts billions in annual trade value. Behind this transformation stands President Faure Gnassingbé, who has ruled Togo since 2005. He saw opportunity where others saw chaos. As France withdrew its troops from West Africa after 65 years of military presence, Gnassingbé quietly repositioned his country not toward Paris, but toward Moscow. He's playing what analysts call a small nation's grand strategy, aligned with whoever can offer leverage, not lectures. Russian officials, too, made no secret of their ambitions. Vladimir Guziev from the Russian Government Commission hailed Togo as a logistical keystone for the entire Gulf of Guinea. And Ambassador Igor Evdokimov emphasized the significance of partnerships in maritime navigation, hydrography, and security, all technical words. But with one clear message: Russia wants a foothold on the Atlantic, and they just got one. But this wasn't a random choice. It was part of a carefully timed sequence of deals that fit together like clockwork. Because just 3 days before the Duma ratified the military pact, Togo signed another agreement, this time with the Sahel Alliance. That alliance, made up of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, had recently cut ties with the Western-backed ECOWAS bloc. They are rich in gold, uranium, and lithium, but landlocked with no direct access to the sea. That's what makes Lomé so strategic. By opening its port to their exports, Togo effectively became the new Atlantic gateway for the Sahel, bypassing the French-controlled trade routes that had dominated for decades. It was a logistical coup, an economic lifeline, and a political statement all at once. And for Russia, it was the perfect opportunity. By aligning with both Togo and the Sahel, Moscow wasn't just selling weapons, it was building corridors both for commerce and influence. It replaced soldiers with contracts and bases with customs hubs. So while the world's attention remained fixed on Europe and the Middle East, a new strategic axis was quietly forming, stretching from the uranium fields of Niger and the gold mines of Burkina Faso through the red earth roads of Mali, all the way down to the docks of Lomé, where Russian ships now have permission to anchor. The map of West Africa, once drawn in Paris, is being redrawn again, not through colonization, but through calculation. And for the first time in generations, it's the African nations themselves deciding which lines to erase. To understand how dramatic this moment truly was, you have to look at what happened just 3 days earlier on October 3, 2025. In a meeting that barely made global headlines, the customs chiefs of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso gathered in Lomé, Togo's capital, and signed a revolutionary economic accord. It wasn't a military pact. It didn't involve weapons or armies. It involved data and sovereignty. The deal linked the customs systems of the 3 Sahel states directly with Togo's port infrastructure through a new digital integration platform. What that meant in practice was simple but monumental. For the first time in history, Mali's gold, Niger's uranium, and Burkina Faso's cotton could be shipped straight through Lomé without going through any French-controlled trade checkpoints. No colonial intermediaries, no European banks deciding transaction flows, just direct African trade governed by African institutions. When Mali's Prime Minister Abdoulaye Maïga took the microphone that day, his words were calm but unmistakable. The road to sovereignty is long and full of obstacles, but we walk it together side by side. His message was a mirror of what Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso had been saying for months, that political independence means nothing without economic independence. This customs deal gave his alliance exactly that, a gateway to the sea and a way out of dependency. The timing couldn't have been more symbolic. 9 months earlier, on January 20, 2024, the 3 Sahel states, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, had officially withdrawn from ECOWAS, the regional bloc long aligned with Western powers. They called the old system a colonial relic and vowed to build a new framework based on self-reliance and collective defense. Now, with Togo joining hands, that framework finally had a physical exit, a corridor to the Atlantic. It was quite literally the moment the landlocked broke free. But this was also the point where things started to get tense, especially for Nigeria. For decades, Nigeria had been the uncontested heavyweight of West African trade. Its ports, its oil, its population, everything screamed dominance. But within just one fiscal quarter of 2025, Nigeria's exports to Togo skyrocketed from 135 billion to over 800 billion naira. That might sound like growth, but it wasn't. It was a diversion. Cargo meant for Nigerian ports was being rerouted through Lomé because it was cheaper, faster, and less corrupt. For Abuja, this was nothing short of an economic alarm bell. Hundreds of billions in customs revenue were suddenly slipping away along with political influence. And as if that wasn't enough, intelligence reports started circulating about Russian naval vessels preparing to dock in Lomé, less than 200 kilometers from Lagos. The symbolism was chilling a new foreign military power, but this time, not Western was arriving right next door. Nigeria's Foreign Minister Yusuf Tuggar voiced his concern publicly. We cannot allow instability along our borders to threaten regional peace, but everyone knew what he really meant. It wasn't instability he feared, it was irrelevance. The ripple effects spread fast. In Ghana, President Nana Akufo-Addo's government began reopening defense talks with Washington. Donald Trump, in his second term and eager to reclaim American influence, called Ghana a model of stability and hinted at new military cooperation deals. The U.S. Embassy in Lomé became unusually active, hosting investment forums and quietly pushing American infrastructure firms to bid for port expansions. But it was too late to undo the optics. Across Africa, social media lit up with one phrase: the Sahel has found the sea. It became more than a slogan. It was a declaration of defiance, a symbol that the once isolated heart of Africa had connected itself to the world on its own terms. And at the center of this movement once again was Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré. His speeches were being replayed from Bamako to Niamey, where he spoke of unity, discipline, and breaking the chains of invisible rule. For millions of young Africans, he became a symbol not of rebellion, but of restoration. Meanwhile, in Paris and Brussels, policy analysts scrambled to understand what had gone wrong. How had a cluster of small, poor, war-torn nations managed to outmaneuver an entire post-colonial system? The answer was disarmingly simple. They worked together and they stopped asking for permission. By mid-October, Lomé's docks were busier than ever. Satellite images showed new warehouses, new cranes, and Russian cargo ships unloading construction materials alongside African goods. The world's most unlikely alliance of former Soviet power and a handful of West African nations was rewriting the rules of global trade. And as the red sun set over the Gulf of Guinea that week, it became clear. This wasn't just an economic shift, it was a psychological break the moment Africa realized it could redraw its borders of dependence and call it by a new name: sovereignty. The ripple effects of the Togo-Russia alliance and the Sahel customs revolution didn't just shift trade maps, they changed lives. From the dusty roads of Ouagadougou to the bustling markets of Lomé, people began to feel something rare in African politics: momentum. In Burkina Faso, the news was received like a national victory. Crowds gathered in city squares waving the Sahel Alliance flags, red, green, and gold, chanting, "Our gold, our sea, our future." For years, generations of miners and farmers had watched the profits of their land flow outward to Paris, to Geneva, to offshore accounts they would never see. Now, for the first time, they believed that wealth might come back home. President Ibrahim Traoré, standing before a sea of citizens in Ouagadougou, declared that this was the first step toward full African sovereignty. He promised new roads to link Burkina Faso's goldfields to Lomé, new training programs for customs officers, and a public audit of every foreign contract signed before 2022. It wasn't just rhetoric, construction had already begun. Satellite data confirmed the groundwork for a 200-kilometer trade corridor from Niamey through Fada Ngourma to Lomé. In Mali and Niger, the story was the same. Malian officials began rewriting mining contracts, insisting that at least 60% of export revenue remain in national banks. Niger, long dependent on France's nuclear industry, announced new uranium deals with Russia and Turkey under the Sahel framework. For millions in the interior, Sahel, where poverty and desertification had stolen hope, this new trade route was more than infrastructure, it was dignity, finally made tangible. But as the people celebrated, political tremors spread through the region's elite. ECOWAS, the Western-backed bloc, suddenly looked like an aging empire. 3 of its members were already gone, and surveys showed that over half of Togo's population favored following them. The phrase "exit ECOWAS" began trending across West African social media. In Abuja, Nigerian lawmakers debated emergency tariffs to keep cargo from bypassing Lagos, while the central bank warned of serious losses in customs revenue. Behind closed doors, analysts estimated hundreds of billions of naira could vanish annually. Inside the European Union, policymakers were alarmed. Brussels had spent decades cultivating economic partnerships with the same coastal states that now appeared ready to flip toward Moscow and Beijing. To them, the sight of African nations building new customs codes without French oversight was nothing short of a strategic shock. But for African observers, it was poetic justice, the kind that arrives decades late but right on time. The transformation wasn't only political, it was deeply psychological. In markets and tea shops, conversations began to shift. People spoke less about aid and more about agency. Fewer young men wanted to migrate north. More wanted to learn logistics, maritime law, or digital customs technology. Local universities opened sovereignty studies programs, teaching students how to manage mineral wealth trade routes and national databases. Still, not everyone was convinced. Some journalists in Ghana and Nigeria warned that Russia is replacing France, not liberating Africa. Civil society groups called for transparency, for proof that these new corridors would serve people, not power brokers. Even within the Sahel Alliance, debates flared over how profits should be shared. Yet amid all the skepticism, one thing was clear: the narrative had flipped. For once, Africa wasn't the passive subject of global decisions, it was the one making them. When asked about the West's anxiety, a Burkina Faso student in Lomé replied simply, If we are finally free to choose our partners, that means the colonial era is over. That statement captured what no statistic could. This wasn't just about ports and contracts. It was about psychological liberation, about reclaiming the right to dream of a future designed in Africa by Africans for Africans. From Washington to Paris, the message from West Africa landed like a tremor. For decades, the region had been treated as a predictable chessboard, a place of aid packages, training missions, and quiet compliance. Now, that board had flipped. In the United States, policymakers watched the Togo-Russia deal unfold with a mix of surprise and unease. America had long relied on Nigeria and Ghana as its security anchors in West Africa. But with Russian warships gaining access to Lomé just a few hundred miles from U.S.-aligned territory, the Pentagon saw what one analyst called a new Mediterranean forming along the Gulf of Guinea. President Donald Trump, back in office, didn't hide his irritation. He publicly called the deal a mistake that opens the door for Russian militarization. Behind closed doors, State Department cables warned of strategic encirclement, the idea that Moscow could now project influence across the Atlantic corridor through a chain of African partners. The fear wasn't just military, it was economic. If Sahel minerals, energy, and trade routes start flowing through Russian logistics systems, the dollar's leverage over regional economies could weaken. At the same time, European capitals, especially Paris and Brussels, faced a reckoning. France had only recently withdrawn the last of its troops from Mali and Niger after decades of anti-terror missions. Now, those same nations were not only replacing French forces with Russian instructors, but also building new trade routes that bypassed French banks and the CFA franc system entirely. For Europe, it was a historic humiliation, the end of what was once called France-Afrique. Across the Atlantic, China observed quietly, almost amused. Beijing saw opportunity in the chaos, offering loans and infrastructure deals to the Sahel Alliance with the same patience that had already secured its foothold in East Africa. In many ways, China didn't need to compete directly. The West was losing Africa by default. But while great powers scrambled, a deeper debate emerged in American policy circles. What if this isn't about Russia or China at all? What if it's about Africa finally choosing itself? Veteran diplomats recalled how Washington's Africa strategy had long focused on counterterrorism and migration control, not on empowering African industry or sovereignty. And now that neglect was coming home to roost. A retired U.S. general put it bluntly, "We lost Africa the same way we lost our own factories by assuming power would last forever." Think tanks began urging a new approach, one based on partnership rather than paternalism. Yet the mood in Washington remained conflicted. For every voice calling to engage, another warned that the Sahel-Russia alliance was a Trojan horse, one that could undermine Western intelligence networks and reshape voting blocs at the UN. Still beyond the fear, there was recognition, a reluctant respect for what leaders like Ibrahim Traoré represented, a generation of Africans refusing to ask permission to stand tall. And as the old world order watches Africa redraw its lines, one question echoes not just in African capitals, but in Washington itself. What happens when the continent we once sought to shape decides to shape us instead? The dust over the Gulf of Guinea has not yet settled. Ships still come and go through the new trade lanes of Lomé. But something far greater than cargo is moving through these waters, an idea. The idea that Africa can at last chart its own course. For the Sahel nations, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and now Togo, this is more than a geopolitical strategy. It's a spiritual correction. A generation of leaders led by men like President Ibrahim Traoré are daring to do what their predecessors could not, to look the world in the eye without lowering their heads. But every revolution carries a warning. New partnerships can build strength or breed dependency in disguise. If Moscow replaces Paris or Beijing replaces Brussels, then sovereignty remains an illusion painted in new colors. The real test is whether Africa can trade, govern, and defend itself without any foreign hand pulling the strings. Still, for millions watching from Ouagadougou to Washington, there is hope, a quiet belief that maybe this time Africa's rise will not be stolen midway. Maybe this time the gold will stay where it was mined, the food where it was grown, and the dignity where it was born. And as history writes this next chapter, one question remains for all of us. Do we have the courage to accept a world where Africa no longer waits for permission, if you believe that truth matters more than propaganda? If you believe that Africa's freedom is not just its own, but the world's second chance, then please share this story. Because this time Africa isn't waiting for the world to notice. It's already moving. And as President Ibrahim Traoré once said, when Africa stands, the world must adjust. Subscribe if you believe the world needs to hear that voice loud and clear.